For decades, my brother used his fortune as a tactical weapon to systematically incinerate my relationships, but he finally chose the wrong target. When I warned my new girlfriend about his history of psychological warfare, she didn't flinch. She simply leaned back, a predatory smirk playing on her lips. "I dismantle arrogant executives for a living," she said, her voice cutting like sharpened steel. "Tell him to come at me with everything he's got. I've been looking for a challenge worthy of my time." Derek has always been the financial golden boy. He runs a massive logistics firm in Chicago and wears Italian suits to brunches. He thrives on making sure everyone in the room knows he holds the power. I am a high school history teacher, making $52,000 a year, which Derek considers a personal insult to our family name. The first time he sabotaged my life, I was 26. I brought Sasha to our parents' Labor Day cookout. By late October, Derek had casually offered her a consulting position at his firm with a $95,000 starting salary. He didn't sleep with her. He just wanted to prove he could buy my happiness. Sasha broke up with me 2 weeks later, claiming our ambitions didn't align. That became his signature move. Anytime I found someone genuine, Derek would step in, wave his limitless checkbook, and offer them a life-changing career opportunity. He poached 3 girlfriends this way. It never looked malicious to our parents. My mother, Adele, constantly praised him for being a generous mentor, while my father, Sullivan, told me I just needed to hustle harder to keep a woman's respect. Even a highly independent architect named Wren, who I dated for over a year, eventually caved when Derek handed her firm a $2.5 million commercial contract. He owned my world, so I completely stopped introducing women to my family. I moved to Austin to put 1,000 miles between us. That is where I met Fiona, at a bouldering gym. She was sharp, calculating, and completely immune to superficial nonsense. She worked as an independent financial compliance officer. When I eventually opened up about Derek's habit of weaponizing his wealth to destroy my relationship, she didn't offer me empty pity. She just chalked her hands and said, "Men who use money to establish dominance over their own blood are almost always hiding catastrophic liabilities." We dated in total secrecy for 9 months. Then, my parents hosted a lavish retirement gala for Sullivan at a massive country club in Dallas on April 12th. I couldn't avoid it, and Fiona insisted on coming. I warned her that Derek would inevitably try to dazzle her with a 6-figure job offer to humiliate me. Fiona smiled, a cold, terrifying smirk. "I dismantle arrogant executives for a living. Let him try." During the cocktail hour, Derek spotted us. He immediately went into his apex predator routine, flashing his diamond watch and offering his usual condescending handshake. But Fiona gave him absolutely nothing. She answered his intrusive questions with brutal, one-word replies, leaving awkward silences that Derek frantically tried to fill with more bragging. Later in the evening, I was grabbing our coats from the cloakroom when I saw Derek corner Fiona near the valet stand. My stomach plummeted. This was the exact mechanism he always used. I watched through the glass doors as he pulled out a gold-embossed business card, leaning in with that familiar smug grin. Fiona didn't shrink away. She took the card from his fingers, tore it perfectly in half, and whispered exactly 2 sentences into his face. I watched my brother physically stagger backward. All the color instantly vanished from his cheeks. He looked like he had just been electrocuted. He didn't even say goodbye to Sullivan or Adele. He practically sprinted to his Mercedes, completely abandoning the gala, and peeled out of the circular driveway. In the silence of the car ride home, I asked Fiona what she could have possibly said to break him. She stared out the window for a long time. "Miles," she said softly, "your brother is currently my primary target. I have been analyzing his fraudulent ledgers every single morning since last November." I nearly swerved off the highway. Fiona revealed she wasn't just a compliance officer. She was a lead forensic investigator for the IR's Criminal Investigation Division. She hadn't known who Derek was when we first met, but the moment I mentioned his specific Chicago logistics firm 6 months ago, she officially recused herself from his specific prosecution file so she could keep dating me without violating federal ethics laws. When Derek had cornered her at the valet stand, he had bragged about his offshore liquidity to impress her. She had leaned in and quietly replied, "Derek, I am Special Agent Hale. I already possess the wire transfers for the Cayman Shell Company you registered on August 4th, and you just attempted to solicit a federal officer." I started laughing uncontrollably. A decade of humiliation was finally evaporating. But Fiona didn't smile. "I'm telling you this tonight because you need to prepare," she said, her voice dead serious. "Men like your brother don't feel shame when they get caught. They feel desperate. Tomorrow morning, his assets will be frozen, and he is absolutely going to try and drain your parents' retirement accounts to flee the country." The laugh died in my throat. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 11:42 p.m. The highway lines blurred into a solid, glowing stripe under the headlights. "Drain their accounts?" I asked, my voice suddenly entirely hollow. "How? He doesn't have their banking passwords. My dad is old school. He keeps his authenticators on a physical fob." Fiona turned her head, the passing streetlights casting long, rhythmic shadows across her face. "He doesn't need a password, Miles. He's the golden child. He's going to call them in a panic, fabricate a supply chain emergency, and ask for a bridge loan. He knows exactly how much liquidity they have, and because he's Derek, they will wire it." The rest of the drive to my parents' house, where I was supposed to stay for the weekend, was agonizing. I dropped Fiona off at her hotel in downtown Dallas. She told me she couldn't come with me, couldn't be present for what happened next. She was off the case, but inserting herself into a live domestic financial dispute while the ink was still drying on the freeze orders was a fast track to getting a defense attorney to claim entrapment. She kissed me, told me to hold my ground, and got out of the car. I pulled into my parents' driveway in Highland Park at 1:15 am. The house was dark. Sullivan's pristine Lexus sat in the garage next to Adele's SUV. I unlocked the front door as quietly as possible, the faint smell of eucalyptus and expensive catering coffee lingering in the foyer from earlier that day. I didn't sleep. I sat in the guest bedroom in the dark, watching the digital clock cycle through the early morning hours, waiting for the inevitable phone call. It came at 6:14 am. The sharp, shrill ring of the landline echoed through the quiet house. My parents are the only people I know who still pay for a landline, mostly because Adele likes the aesthetic of the cordless phones on their charging docks. I was out of bed before the second ring. I moved down the carpeted hallway just as I heard the heavy thud of Sullivan's footsteps leaving the master suite. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, my father was already in the kitchen, pulling the phone off the receiver. He was wearing his navy silk bathrobe, his hair ruffled from sleep. "Hello?" he rasped, clearing his throat. A beat of silence. "Derek, son, slow down. It's 6 in the morning. What's wrong?" I stopped on the bottom step. My heart was hammering against my ribs. "What port authority?" Sullivan asked, pulling out a bar stool and sitting down. He was rubbing the bridge of his nose. Derek, I can barely hear you. You sound like you're in a wind tunnel. Just breathe. I stepped into the kitchen. Sullivan didn't even look at me. His brow was furrowed in deep concentration. A freeze on the shipping containers? Why would they do that? Sullivan paused, listening to Derek's frantic voice vibrating through the earpiece. A bond issue. Okay, how much to clear it? Another pause. Sullivan's eyes widened slightly. 3.2 million, Sullivan repeated softly. Derek, that's practically our entire liquid portfolio. You know I just retired. The capital gains alone if I liquidate the Vanguard accounts on a Monday morning. I walked up to the island. Dad, hang up the phone. Sullivan swatted his hand at me without looking up, like I was a gnat. Hold on, Derek. Miles is in here hovering. I said hang up, I said, my voice louder, sharper than I had ever spoken to him. Sullivan covered the mouthpiece. Excuse me? I am on the phone with your brother. He's having a business crisis. Go make coffee or go back to bed. It's not a business crisis, I said. He's under federal investigation. His accounts are frozen. If you send him that money, you are never getting it back, and you will be accessory to wire fraud. Sullivan stared at me. For a second, I thought he actually heard me. I thought the absolute certainty in my voice had pierced through 30 years of conditioning. But then his expression hardened into that familiar, disappointed sneer, the one he reserved exclusively for me. Are you out of your mind? Sullivan hissed. Your brother is trying to save a multi-million-dollar contract, and you're standing here making up lunatic conspiracy theories because you're still bitter he embarrassed you in front of that cold woman you brought to the party yesterday? Dad, I am begging you. Do not send him a dime. Sullivan took his hand off the mouthpiece. Derek, I'm putting you on speaker. Your brother is standing here having a mental breakdown. He hit a button on the base station. Derek's voice filled the kitchen. Telling you, Dad, it has to be routed through the Nassau account by 8 a.m. or the port seizes the inventory. I'll have the funds back in your account by Wednesday with 10% interest. I swear to God. Derek didn't sound like a golden boy. He didn't sound like the guy who bought his way out of every minor inconvenience. He sounded terrified. The background noise wasn't a wind tunnel. It was the highway. He was driving. Fast, Derek. I said loudly toward the phone. Fiona told me everything. I know where you're going. The line went dead silent. Only the static hum of tires on asphalt. Miles? Derek's voice cracked. You put her up to this. Put her up to what? Sullivan demanded, looking between me and the phone. Derek, what is your brother talking about? He's trying to ruin me, Dad. Derek yelled, his voice suddenly pitching into pure hysteria. He brought a Fed to the gala. He set me up. You need to authorize the transfer right now, Dad. Log into the Charles Schwab portal. Now. A Fed? Sullivan repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. Adele walked into the kitchen then, tightening the belt on her robe, her eyes darting between Sullivan and me. Arthur, what is all this shouting? She asked. Derek is in trouble, Sullivan said, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his iPad, resting on the corner of the island. I don't know what Miles is doing. I am saving your retirement, I said, lunging forward and slamming my hand down on top of the iPad before Sullivan could unlock it. Mom, Derek's assets were frozen this morning by the ears. He's trying to drain your accounts to flee the country. Don't listen to him. Derek screamed through the speaker. They're trying to freeze my liquidity because of a clerical error. It's an overreach. If I don't move the capital out of domestic jurisdiction today, the company goes under. Dad, get the iPad away from him. Adele put a hand over her mouth. Domestic jurisdiction? Derek, honey, where are you right now? I'm on I-35 South, Derek snapped, heading for the airstrip in San Marcos. I have a charter waiting. Dad, I need you to bypass the two-factor authentication. Just give me the verbal authorization code for the Vanguard sweep account. Sullivan stared at the speakerphone. The absolute faith he had in his eldest son was suddenly colliding with the reality of the words airstrip, domestic jurisdiction, and charter. Derek, Sullivan said, his voice trembling now. You want me to send $3 million to a Nassau account so you can get on a private plane? It's a bridge loan. Derek roared. No, Sullivan said quietly. He pulled his hand back from the iPad. No, I need to call our lawyer. I need to understand what's happening. There's no time for lawyers. Derek's voice was getting frantic, the sound of the car engine revving higher in the background. Dad, if you don't do this, I am going to prison. Do you understand me? They are going to put your son in federal prison. Adele let out a small, sharp gasp and grabbed the edge of the counter. Sullivan looked at me. His face was pale, the arrogant certainty completely washed away. He looked like an old man. He looked down at the iPad under my hand, then back to the phone. Derek, Sullivan whispered. What did you do? I did what I had to do to build the life you brag about. Derek shot back, vicious and cornered. Now give me the damn authorization code. I won't do it, Sullivan said. His voice broke. I can't. A long, heavy silence stretched over the speakerphone, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of highway expansion joints. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me. My dad had actually drawn the line. We were safe. Then, Derek let out a low, breathy laugh. It was a terrible sound. It didn't sound desperate anymore. It sounded cold. I didn't want to do it this way, Dad, Derek said softly. I really wanted you to just hand it over so we could pretend it was a favor. Sullivan frowned. Do what? 2 years ago, Derek said, his voice flattening out into the boardroom tone he used to fire people. When you had your prostate scare, you signed the paperwork to consolidate the Highland Park estate and the Vanguard accounts into the Callaway family revocable trust to protect the assets in case things went south. Sullivan's face went from pale to ash gray. Yes, you set that up for us. I did, Derek said. And as the primary architect of that trust, you legally designated me as the sole managing trustee with unilateral transfer authority in the event of a medical or financial emergency. The kitchen felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. What are you saying? Adele whispered. I'm saying, Derek replied over the phone, that I initiated the wire transfer for $3.2 million 10 minutes before I called you. I only called to get the verbal two-factor code to bypass the fraud hold, but since you're being difficult, I'll just route it through the corporate clearinghouse. It takes a little longer, but it bypasses the personal authentication. Derek, you can't, Sullivan choked out, grabbing the iPad and frantically typing his passcode. That's everything. The house, the retirement, everything. You should have taught Miles to stay in his lane, Derek said. Tell him thanks for the motivation. The line clicked dead. Sullivan was frantically tapping the Vanguard app on his screen. I watched over his shoulder as the loading circle spun, the blue line crawling across the top. When the dashboard finally materialized, the total balance in the primary sweep account sat at 0 cents. Beneath it, a gray italicized line read, processing outbound wire, Nassau Continental Bank. Sullivan dropped the iPad. It clattered against the marble island. He looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified, completely devoid of the paternal superiority he had carried my entire life. He took it, Sullivan whispered. He took all of it. Adele made a sound like she had swallowed glass. She rushed around the kitchen island, her hands hovering over Sullivan's shoulders as if she didn't know where to touch him. She looked at the iPad screen, then at the dead landline receiver, and finally at me. Her eyes were wide wide, panicked, and entirely desperate for a lifeline. "Call him back," she ordered, her voice trembling. "Sullivan, call him back right now." The line just dropped. "He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't steal from us." "Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "He didn't drop the call. He hung up. He took the money." "No," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is your fault. You and that awful woman you brought to the party. You threatened him. You backed him into a corner." I stared at her. 30 years of blatant favoritism, and even now, with the literal zero balance glowing on the screen, she was still protecting him. "He backed himself into a corner by committing federal tax fraud, Mom," I said. I reached across the marble counter and grabbed the iPad. "Dad, we have to call Vanguard's fraud department. Right now. The wire is still processing. If it hits the clearinghouse before we flag it, it's gone forever." Sullivan didn't move. He sat perfectly still on the bar stool, staring at the empty space where the iPad had been. The arrogance that usually radiated from him was entirely gone. He just looked like a frail, 70-year-old man in a bathrobe. "Dad," I said louder. "The phone." He blinked slowly, then nodded. He picked up his cell phone from the counter with a shaking hand and unlocked it. He had to type his PIN 3 times before he got it right. I fed him the 1-800 number from the back of the Vanguard debit card sitting in his wallet. The automated system felt like it was designed to torture us. "Press 1 for personal accounts. Press 2 for institutional. Please enter your 9-digit social security number." Every second that ticked by was another mile. Derek was driving toward San Marcos. I could picture him perfectly, white-knuckling the steering wheel of his Mercedes, eyes darting to the rearview mirror, calculating his escape velocity. Finally, a human voice came on the line, a tired-sounding man named Greg. "Yes, my name is Sullivan Calloway," my father said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. "There is an outbound wire transfer processing on my sweep account. It's for $3.2 million. I need you to stop it immediately. It's fraudulent." I could hear the frantic clacking of a keyboard through the speaker. "Okay, Mr. Calloway, I see the pending transfer here," Greg said, his tone instantly shifting from bored customer service to high alert. "Routing to Nassau Continental. Sir, this wire was initiated via the Calloway Family Revocable Trust Portal. The authorization was completed by the managing trustee, Derek Calloway. Is he present?" Sullivan closed his eyes. "No, he's my son. He stole it. You have to freeze the transfer." "Sir, if Derek Calloway is the legally designated managing trustee with unilateral transfer authority, the system doesn't flag it as fraud," Greg explained, his voice tight. "He has the legal right to move those funds. He's fleeing the country." I yelled toward the phone, no longer caring about boundaries. "He's under active investigation by the EAR's Criminal Investigation Division. His personal assets were frozen this morning. He is using this trust to bypass the freeze and abscond with stolen capital." There was a heavy pause on the line. The keyboard clacking stopped. "Who am I speaking with?" Greg asked. "Miles Calloway," I said. "I'm the secondary beneficiary on that trust. Look, you need to escalate this to your legal compliance team right now. If Vanguard facilitates the transfer of funds for a fleeing felon under federal indictment, your institution becomes liable." I had no idea if that was legally true, but I channeled every ounce of Fiona's cold, calculating energy. "Hold please," Greg said. Hold music started playing, a smooth, nauseating jazz track. We sat in the kitchen for 12 agonizing minutes. Outside the bay windows, the sky was just starting to turn a bruised, pale purple. The neighborhood was waking up. I could hear the faint hum of a lawnmower a few streets over. It was surreal. My parents' entire reality was evaporating in real time, and the world was just having a normal Sunday morning. Adele had retreated to the corner of the kitchen. She was holding her own cell phone to her ear, frantically dialing Derek's number over and over again. Each time, she would listen for a few seconds, pull the phone away, and dial again. It was going straight to voicemail. He turned it off, she whispered, her voice cracking. She looked at Sullivan. "Arthur, what are we going to do? The house, the taxes on this house alone." "Stop talking, Adele," Sullivan said quietly. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard him speak to her with anything other than absolute devotion. The music clicked off. A new voice came on the line. A woman this time. Brisk, professional, and completely lacking warmth. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Brenda. I am a manager with the fraud mitigation team. I understand you are claiming the managing trustee is currently under federal investigation?" "Yes," Sullivan said, rubbing his temples. "Sir, we have cross-referenced the trustee, Derek Calloway, across the federal database. There are no active freezes, liens, or flags on his profile in our system. Because he is the authorized executor of the trust, we cannot legally halt a pending wire transfer simply based on a verbal claim of fraud from a non-managing party. We would need a federal injunction, an active court order, or a direct freeze mandate from a verified federal agency." "You have to be kidding me," I said. "It's Sunday morning. We can't get a court order today." "I am very sorry," Brenda said, and she actually sounded it. "The wire is currently in the clearinghouse queue. It will hit the international transit window at 8:00 am Eastern Time. Unless we receive official agency documentation before then, the transfer will complete automatically." I looked at the clock on the stove. 6:48 am Central Time. That was 7:48 am Eastern. We had 12 minutes. Sullivan dropped his phone onto the counter. He buried his face in his hands. He was crying. The man who had spent my entire adult life telling me I was a financial failure, that I lacked ambition, that I was an embarrassment to his legacy. He was weeping openly at his kitchen island because the son he worshipped had gutted him. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened my texts and tapped on Fiona's name. I had promised I wouldn't drag her into this. She had explicitly told me it was an ethics violation, but I had 12 minutes before my parents became destitute. I typed, "He drained the trust. 3.2 M Vanguard sweep to Nassau. Bank won't stop it without federal proof of investigation. Wire clears at 8 am EST. I have 10 minutes. Tell me what to do." I hit send. The delivery receipt popped up instantly. I watched the screen. 3 minutes passed. Nothing. 4 minutes. 5. At 6:54 am, the 3 gray dots appeared. They danced for a few seconds, disappeared, and then reappeared. My phone buzzed. "Fiona, I cannot intervene. It taints the prosecution, but Vanguard is lying to you to cover their own liability. The freeze orders were signed at midnight by a federal judge. They are in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network database as of 4:00 am. If Vanguard processes that wire, they are violating the Bank Secrecy Act." My phone buzzed again a second later. "Fiona, tell the fraud manager to check the FinCEN 314 secure ledger under his social security number. Do not ask them. Tell them." I slammed my hand down on the counter, making Sullivan jump. I grabbed his phone and took it off speaker, pressing it to my ear. "Brenda, are you still there?" I demanded. "Yes, sir," she replied. "You're checking the wrong database," I said, pacing across the kitchen. "You need to check the FinCEN 314 secure ledger. The freeze orders were signed at midnight and entered into into the system at 4 a.m. If you process this wire, Vanguard is officially in violation of the Bank Secrecy Act and facilitating international money laundering. Silence. I could hear her breathing. One moment, she said. I stood by the window, watching the sun crest over the manicured hedges of my parents' backyard. The silence dragged on. 6:56 a.m. 6:57 a.m. Mr. Calloway. Brenda's voice returned. It was completely different now. The corporate neutrality was gone. She sounded rattled. We have located the FinCEN flag on the trustee's profile. So stop the wire, I said. The outbound transfer has been halted, she said, typing rapidly. The funds are being reversed back to the primary sweep account. The entire Calloway family revocable trust is now locked under a federal hold. No funds can move in or out without authorization from the Department of Justice. I let out a breath that I felt like I had been holding for 10 years. Thank you, I managed to say. Sir, you need to retain legal counsel immediately, Brenda advised quietly. The FBI will likely be contacting you regarding the trust's association with the managing trustee. She hung up. I slowly lowered the phone. I looked at Sullivan. He was staring at me, his eyes red and bloodshot. Adele had stopped pacing and was gripping the back of one of the bar stools. They stopped it, I said, my voice hoarse. The money is back in the account, but the whole trust is locked down by the feds. You can't touch it until this is cleared up. Sullivan stared at me. He looked down at his hands, then back up at my face. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that I had just saved his life. He was just broken. Adele, however, couldn't let it go. The reality of Derek's betrayal was too massive for her brain to process, so she defaulted to the only coping mechanism she had ever known. They locked the account? She asked, her voice rising in pitch. Miles, how are we supposed to pay the contractors for the patio remodel? How are we supposed to pay the property taxes next month? You just froze our entire lives. I stared at her, the sheer, unadulterated delusion of it. Mom, I said, stepping toward her, your golden boy just tried to steal every penny you have to fund his escape from federal prison. I just saved you from dying in a Medicaid facility. If you want to yell at someone about the patio remodel, try calling Derek. I'm sure he has great reception on the runway in San Marcos. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the kitchen, went upstairs to the guest room, and started packing my bag. I wasn't staying the weekend. I wasn't staying another hour. The air in that house felt poisonous. I zipped up my duffel, grabbed my keys, and walked back downstairs. Sullivan was sitting exactly where I had left him. Adele was standing by the window, staring blankly out at the lawn. Neither of them looked at me as I walked toward the front door. Miles, Sullivan's voice croaked just as my hand hit the doorknob. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. He's really going to prison? Sullivan asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was the desperate question of a man watching his religion burn to the ground. Yes, Dad, I said quietly. He is. I walked out into the cool morning air, threw my bag into the trunk of my 10-year-old Honda, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was an unknown number, a local Austin area code. I hesitated, then hit accept. Hello, Miles. Derek's voice came through the speakers. He didn't sound frantic anymore. He sounded terrifyingly calm. The charter pilot just told me the payment bounced. The wire was reversed. Yeah, it was, I said, pulling onto the main road. I called the bank, Derek. It's over. They found the FinCEN flag. The trust is frozen. He laughed. A short, sharp sound. You think you're pretty smart, don't you? You and your Fed girlfriend. I think you're out of options, I replied. Where are you going to go, Derek? You have no cash. You have no plane. Just turn yourself in. I'm not going to prison, little brother, Derek said. The sound of the wind rushing past his car was loud. He had the windows down. But you need to understand something. I didn't build my company entirely on my own. I had investors, silent partners, people who don't care about ears freezes, but who care very much about the $6 million in offshore liquidity that I was supposed to secure for them today. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. What are you talking about? I'm saying the feds aren't the only ones looking for me right now, Derek said softly. And when they realize I'm gone, they're going to start looking at the people I left behind, the people whose names are legally tied to my financial portfolio. The trust, I whispered. Dad signed the paperwork 2 years ago, Derek reminded me, his voice dripping with malice. He's technically a listed corporate officer on the holding company that feeds the Cayman shell. I set it up that way for tax benefits. He thought it was brilliant at the time. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car onto the shoulder of the road. Derek, you didn't. I told you, Miles, he said. I don't lose. If I go down, everyone goes down. Give my best to Fiona. The line clicked dead. I sat on the shoulder of the road for a long time. The engine of my Civic idled, a rhythmic, vibrating rattle that I usually ignored. Right now, it was the only sound tethering me to reality. The dashboard clock read 7:14 am. The Texas heat was already starting to bake the asphalt outside, radiating up through the floorboards. I stared at the black screen of my phone. If I go down, everyone goes down. Derek wasn't just lashing out. He didn't make empty threats. His entire life was built on leverage, on making sure he always held the keys to someone else's destruction if they ever tried to cross him. If he said Sullivan was legally tied to the Cayman shell, it wasn't a bluff. It was a failsafe. I put the car in drive, but I didn't merge back onto the road. Instead, I pulled up my recent calls and hit Fiona's number. She answered on the first ring. Miles, where are you? Her voice was sharp, professional, the special agent tone. I'm in my car. About 2 miles from my parents' house, I said. My mouth felt like cotton. Derek just called me. A heavy silence fell over the line. Why did you answer it? Because I thought he was calling to scream at me about the bounced wire, and he did. But Fiona, he said something else. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He said he has silent partners, investors who are expecting $6 million in offshore liquidity today. And he said my dad is legally tied to the portfolio. He listed him as a corporate officer on the holding company 2 years ago when he set up the family trust. I heard the sound of a chair scraping against a hardwood floor on her end. Did Sullivan sign the incorporation documents? Fiona asked. There was no empathy in her voice right now, only rapid calculating assessment. Did he physically or digitally sign anything naming him as an officer, director, or managing partner of the holding entity? I don't know. Derek handled all of their estate planning when my dad got sick a couple of years ago. My dad trusts him blindly. If Derek put a stack of papers in front of him and said sign here to protect the house, my dad would have signed it without reading a single paragraph. Miles, listen to me very carefully, Fiona said, her tone dropping an octave. The IR's Criminal Investigation Division doesn't care about family dynamics. They care about signatures on ledgers. If Sullivan's name is on that holding company, and that holding company is the primary vehicle Derek used to funnel illicit funds offshore, your father is no longer just a victim of theft. On paper, he is a co-conspirator in a federal tax evasion and money laundering scheme. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. He didn't know. Fiona, He's a retired regional manager for a paper supply company. He doesn't even know how to bypass a two-factor authentication on his iPad without my help. He didn't launder money. It doesn't matter what he knows, she replied bluntly. It matters what the federal prosecutors can prove he signed. And if Derek's silent partners are who I think they are, the feds are going to be the least of your father's problems. Those people don't file lawsuits when their money goes missing. They liquidate assets. What do? You go back to that house, Fiona said. You find the physical copies of the trust and the holding company documents. You do not let your parents destroy anything, even if they panic. And you call Holt Keating. He's a white-collar criminal defense attorney in Dallas. Used to be a federal prosecutor in my division. I will text you his private cell number right now. Tell him I told you to call. Do not speak to any federal agents without Holt present. Do you understand me? Yes, I have to go, Miles. I can't be a part of this anymore. I'm sorry. I know. Thank you. She hung up. A second later, a contact card for Holt Keating popped up on my screen. I did a U-turn right there on the shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dry, red dust, and drove back toward Highland Park. The contrast between the pristine, wealthy neighborhood and the absolute destruction happening inside my parents' walls was nauseating. Sprinklers were sweeping across manicured lawns in perfect arcs. A woman in expensive Lululemon gear was jogging a golden retriever past the wrought iron gates. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. I walked through the front door without knocking. Adele was in the living room, sitting on the edge of the cream-colored sofa. She had her phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight and aggressively cheerful. Yes, Susan, I know. It's just a terrible migraine. Sullivan is completely out of commission. No, the gala was lovely, thank you, but we simply won't make it to the club for brunch today. We need a quiet Sunday. I stared at her. Her world was actively burning to the foundation. Her son was fleeing the country. Their life savings were frozen under a federal hold, and her primary concern was maintaining social appearances with the country club tennis committee. It was a sickness. I walked past her without a word and headed straight for Sullivan's home office at the back of the house. The door was partially open. The room smelled like stale coffee and old leather. Sullivan was standing behind his massive oak desk. He had 3 different metal filing cabinets pulled open, and the surface of his desk was covered in thick manila folders. He looked up when I walked in. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. I thought you left, he said. His voice was hollow. I tried to, I replied, stepping into the room and closing the heavy wooden door behind me to block out the sound of Adele's phone calls. Derek called me on my way out of the neighborhood. Sullivan froze, a stack of papers clutched in his hands. He called you? Did he say where he was? He's running, Dad. It doesn't matter where he is. What matters is what he left behind. I walked up to the edge of the desk. He told me he had investors, silent partners who are missing $6 million today. And he told me that you are legally listed as a corporate officer on the holding company that feeds his offshore accounts. Sullivan stared at me, the papers in his hands trembling slightly. He slowly lowered them to the desk. That's not what the holding company was for. What was it for, Dad? It was a tax shelter, Sullivan insisted, pointing a shaky finger at a thick binder on the edge of the desk. Derek set it up when I retired. He said the capital gains on liquidating my shares in the paper company were going to eat up 30% of my retirement. He said if we consolidated the house, the Vanguard accounts, and the stock payouts into a corporate holding entity, we could defer the taxes indefinitely. It was perfectly legal. He had his firm's accountants draw it up. Dad, Derek doesn't have accountants. He has fixers. What is the name of the holding company? Sullivan swallowed hard. Callaway Logistics International. Show me the incorporation papers. He didn't argue this time. He didn't tell me to stay in my lane or mind my own business. He reached for the heavy black binder, flipped it open, and started turning the dense, legal pages. He stopped about halfway through and spun the binder around to face me. There it was. An official certificate of incorporation filed in the state of Delaware. Callaway Logistics International, LLC. I scanned the listed corporate officers. Managing Director, Derek Arthur Callaway. Vice President of Operations, Sullivan James Callaway. Below that, perfectly centered on the signature line, was my father's distinct looping signature in dark blue ink. Did you read any of this before you signed it? I asked, my voice flat. Sullivan looked at the signature like it belonged to a stranger. He's my son, Miles. He was making $3 million a year. He went to Wharton. Why would I read a 50-page tax document when he told me he had already optimized it? Because he made you the fall guy, I said, tapping the page. Look at this clause right here. Section 4, Article B. I traced my finger under a block of dense legal text. I am not a lawyer, but even I could understand the horrifying implications of the phrasing. In the event of institutional insolvency or federal asset forfeiture, the Vice President of Operations assumes full fiduciary responsibility for all outstanding corporate liabilities, both domestic and international. Sullivan leaned in, reading the words. His breathing turned shallow, rapid. He indemnified himself. I said quietly, if the company gets raided, Derek's personal assets are shielded by the LLC structure. But he wrote a specific clause making you personally liable for the company's debts if it goes under. You signed away your own protection. He wouldn't, Sullivan whispered, pulling the binder closer to his chest like a shield. He wouldn't do that to me. I paid for his college. I gave him the down payment for his first house. He didn't just steal your retirement, Dad. He weaponized your trust to protect his own money. The feds aren't going to look at this and see a grieving father. They are going to see a vice president of operations who signed a legal document accepting full responsibility for millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. Sullivan collapsed into his heavy leather desk chair. He put his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. We need a lawyer, I said, pulling out my phone. Fiona gave me a name, Holt Keating. He's a former federal prosecutor. I'm calling him right now. Before I could dial, the heavy oak door to the study swung open. Adele stood in the doorway, her phone clutched in her hand. Her aggressive cheerfulness was completely gone. She looked pale, her eyes wide and fixed on Sullivan. Arthur, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sullivan looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion. What is it, Adele? The bank just called, she said, stepping into the room. Not Vanguard, our local branch, the one that holds the mortgage on this house. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Mom, the house is paid off. You've owned it free and clear for 10 years. Adele shook her head slowly, looking at me, then at Sullivan. That's what I told the branch manager. I told him he had the wrong account, but he said a secondary lien was placed on the property 18 months ago. Sullivan stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the mahogany bookshelves. A lien? By who? By a private equity firm in Chicago, Adele said, a tear finally spilling over her lower lash line. They hold the commercial credit line for Callaway Logistics International. The manager said the house was put up as collateral for a $4 million corporate loan. The loan defaulted this morning at 6:20 a.m. The room went dead silent. Derek hadn't just drained their cash. He had secretly remortgaged their home to fund his own company, using Sullivan's signature as the vice president of operations to authorize the collateral. They're foreclosing, Adele sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand. Arthur, they said if the balance isn't settled by Friday, they are initiating immediate asset seizure. They're taking the house. The room felt like it was tilting. The silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the faint ticking of Sullivan's antique desk clock. Adele stood frozen, her hand still pressed against her mouth, waiting for someone to tell her it was a misunderstanding. But Sullivan didn't move. He just stared at the Delaware Incorporation certificate sitting on his desk. I pulled my phone out and dialed the number Fiona had texted me. I didn't care that I was doing it in front of them. Holt Keating, a voice answered on the second ring, deep, gravelly, with the ambient noise of traffic in the background. My name is Miles Calloway, I said. Fiona Hale told me to call you. The background noise muted slightly, like he had just rolled up a car window. Fiona doesn't hand out this number unless the house is actively burning down. What's the fire? My brother is Derek Calloway. He runs Calloway Logistics International in Chicago. He's currently fleeing the country. His assets were frozen by the ears this morning, and he just drained my parents' revocable trust. But it gets worse. I looked at Sullivan, who was slowly rocking back and forth in his leather chair. He made my father the vice president of operations of his holding company 2 years ago, and he just defaulted on a $4 million commercial credit line that used my parents' primary residence as collateral. Holt exhaled slowly. It sounded like a tire losing air. Did your father sign the incorporation documents? Yes, and an indemnification clause. Jesus Christ, Holt muttered. Okay, listen to me, Miles. Where are you right now? At their house. Highland Park, Dallas. Get them out of there. What? Why? The bank said they have until Friday. I don't give a damn about the bank, Holt interrupted, his voice sharpening into a razor edge. If Derek used that house to secure a commercial loan for a holding company that the ears suspects is a front for money laundering, the federal government is going to seize that property. And they don't wait for Friday. When the 314 flag hit the FinCEN database this morning, it triggered an automatic asset forfeiture protocol. They will send agents to secure the premises to ensure no documents or physical assets are destroyed. You have maybe 2 hours. Get your parents, get their medications, get any physical ledgers or hard drives related to the trust, and leave. Where do we go? Their accounts are frozen. You take them to a Marriott and you put it on your credit card, Holt said. Do not let them take anything expensive. No jewelry, no art, no luxury cars. If they drive off in a Porsche that's registered to the trust, it's considered flight with federal assets. Take your car. I need you in my office in downtown Dallas at noon tomorrow. Bring your father and bring the binder. Can you do that? Yeah, I said. I can do that. Good. And Miles, do not let your father speak to anyone with a badge. If they are waiting outside when you leave, you hand them my card and you keep walking. Tell him to shut his mouth. Derek served him up on a silver platter, and the DOJ will absolutely eat him if he starts rambling about tax deferments. The call ended. I slid the phone into my pocket and turned back to my parents. Mom, I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Go upstairs. Pack a suitcase. You need clothes for a week, your prescriptions, and your toiletries. Nothing else. Adele dropped her hand. Her eyes narrowed. The panic was morphing into indignation. I am not leaving my home, Miles. This is absurd. We will call the bank on Monday and explain that Derek made a mistake. We are not checking into a hotel like vagrants. Mom, this isn't a suggestion, I snapped, stepping closer to her. The bank isn't coming for the house. The federal government is. The ears is going to raid this property to seize it as a criminal asset because Derek used it to launder money. They are going to put yellow tape across your front door. If you are here when they arrive, they will question you, and if Dad says the wrong thing, they will arrest him. Adele flinched like I had slapped her. She looked at Sullivan for backup. For 30 years, he had been the ultimate authority in this house. He had an answer for everything. He always knew exactly who to call, who to threaten, or who to pay to make inconveniences disappear. Sullivan didn't look at her. He was staring blankly at the floorboards. Arthur, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Tell him he's being dramatic. Tell him to fix it. Sullivan slowly lifted his head. His eyes were entirely vacant. The aggressive, domineering executive I had known my whole life had been hollowed out in the span of 2 hours. Pack a bag, Adele, he whispered, his voice cracking. Do what the boy says. Adele let out a ragged sob and practically fled the room. I could hear her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood stairs. I walked over to the desk. I picked up the heavy black binder containing the Calloway Family Revocable Trust and the LLC incorporation documents. I tucked it under my arm. Get your shoes on, Dad, I said, and your wallet. We're leaving in 10 minutes. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, gripping the armrests of his chair to push himself up. 20 minutes later, we were standing in the driveway. The Texas sun was fully up now, casting harsh, bright light across the perfectly manicured lawn. The neighborhood was painfully quiet. A sprinkler head hissed in the distance. Adele was clutching a large Louis Vuitton duffel bag. Her hands were shaking violently. She kept looking back at the house, at the grand brick fade and the massive oak doors, as if she couldn't comprehend that she wasn't going back inside. My car, Sullivan said suddenly, pointing toward the closed garage. I need my keys. We can't all fit in your Honda. You're not taking the Lexus, Dad, I said, popping the trunk of my Civic and throwing Adele's expensive duffel next to my worn-out gym bag. The lawyer said you can't take anything of value. The cars, the jewelry, the art, it's all considered federal collateral now. If you drive the Lexus off the property, they can charge you with concealing assets. Sullivan looked at the garage door. He had bought that car 6 months ago as a retirement present to himself. He had spent an entire Sunday afternoon explaining to me why the leather stitching was superior to anything I would ever be able to afford. Now, it was just another trap Derek had left for him. He slumped his shoulders and walked toward my passenger side door. He didn't complain about the crushed goldfish crackers on the floor mat or the smell of old coffee. He just folded his large frame into the worn fabric seat and stared straight ahead. Adele got into the back. She didn't say a word. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. I didn't look back at the house. I just kept my eyes on the road, navigating the winding, tree-lined streets of Highland Park until we merged onto the highway. I found a Courtyard Marriott off the interstate. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't the Four Seasons either. It was the kind of place Sullivan would have previously refused to even step into to use the restroom. I walked up to the front desk and handed the clerk my credit card. My $52,000 teacher salary suddenly felt very small as I booked 2 adjoining rooms for an indefinite number of nights. I watched the pending charge notification pop up on my phone. I had about $3,000 in my checking account. That was it. That was the entirety of the Calloway family's liquid wealth right now. We went up to the 3rd floor. The room smelled heavily of industrial carpet cleaner and synthetic lavender. Adele walked into her room, took one look at the generic artwork bolted to the wall, and sat down on on the edge of the stiff mattress. She didn't take her coat off. She just sat there, clutching her purse. I'm going to go get us some water and coffee from the lobby, I told them, standing in the doorway between the two rooms. Don't turn on the TV. Don't look at your phones. If anyone calls from a number you don't know, ignore it. I mean it, Mom. Do not talk to Susan from the tennis committee. Adele didn't respond. She just stared at the blank television screen. I walked down the hall, took the elevator to the lobby, and found a small convenience market next to the reception desk. I bought 3 overpriced bottles of water, some instant coffee, and a pack of generic ibuprofen. My hands were shaking as I swiped my debit card. The adrenaline of the morning was finally starting to crash, leaving behind a cold, nauseating dread. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting it to be Fiona, or maybe Holt Keating again. It was an unknown number, but it wasn't an Austin area code this time. It was a 312 area code. Chicago. I stared at the screen. Derek's company was based in Chicago. I remembered what Holt had said about not talking to anyone, but this wasn't federal law enforcement. Feds usually called from blocked numbers, or they just showed up at your door. This felt different. This felt like the people Derek had warned me about. The silent partners. I let it ring out. It went to voicemail. A minute later, a text message arrived from the same number. Miles, we know your brother didn't make the flight out of San Marcos. We also know the transfer from the Vanguard Trust bounced. He owes us a significant amount of capital, and he is no longer answering his phone. We assume you are helping your father navigate his new responsibilities as Vice President of Operations. We will be in Dallas tomorrow. We expect a timeline for the repayment of the commercial loan. Do not make us come looking for the binder. I read the text 3 times. The letters started to blur together. They knew about the bounced wire. They knew about San Marcos. They knew my father's exact title on the holding company. And they knew about the black binder currently sitting on the desk in room 312. I walked over to the lobby windows and looked out at the parking lot. My beat-up Civic was parked under a glaring street lamp. Anyone could have followed us. Anyone could have traced my license plate. I hit reply and typed a single sentence, my thumbs hovering over the glass. I don't know who you are, but you need to speak to our attorney. I deleted it. Fiona had told me not to engage. You don't negotiate with people who liquidate assets. I put the phone back in my pocket, grabbed the plastic bag with the water and coffee, and headed back to the elevator. When I opened the door to room 312, Sullivan was standing by the window looking out at the highway traffic. He had taken off his suit jacket and unbuttoned the collar of his dress shirt. He looked exhausted, defeated, but there was a strange manic energy humming beneath the surface now. The initial shock had worn off, and panic was settling in. Miles, he said, turning around as I walked in. I've been thinking, that's probably a bad idea right now, Dad, I said, setting the plastic bag on the small, circular table in the corner. Just drink some water. No, listen to me, he insisted, walking toward me. The holding company, Callaway Logistics International. It owns the warehouse leases in Chicago. It owns the delivery fleets. There are hard assets tied to that LLC. If the commercial loan defaulted, the private equity firm will try to liquidate those assets first to cover the debt. The house is just secondary collateral. I stared at him. He was actually trying to math his way out of this. He was still clinging to the illusion that this was a standard corporate restructuring problem. Dad, there are no warehouses, I said slowly, trying to break through the delusion. There are no delivery fleets. Sullivan frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. What are you talking about? Derek runs a logistics firm. He has hundreds of employees. He has contracts with major retailers. Fiona told me she's been analyzing his ledgers since November, I explained, keeping my voice low so Adele wouldn't hear from the adjoining room. It's a shell game, Dad. He subcontracts everything through third-party vendors and inflates the invoices to show massive profit margins on paper. The cash flow isn't coming from shipping containers. It's coming from investors. He's taking their capital, routing it offshore through the holding company, and paying out fabricated dividends to keep them quiet. It's a Ponzi scheme, wrapped in a freight company. Sullivan stepped back, as if I had physically shoved him. No, I've seen the quarterly reports. He brought them to Thanksgiving. They were fake. The commercial contracts, fake. The architect you dated, he got her firm a $2.5 million contract. Sullivan yelled, his voice rising in desperation. And where did that money come from, Dad? I shot back. It came from the same pool of stolen capital. He bought her off with dirty money, just to prove he could. He doesn't have real assets. The only real asset he had left was your house, and he handed it over to a private equity firm in Chicago that is currently texting my phone looking for their $6 million. Sullivan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked past me, toward the black binder resting on the hotel bed. They texted you? He whispered. Yes, they know he missed his flight. They know the Vanguard wire bounced, and they know you are the Vice President of Operations. They said they are coming to Dallas tomorrow to get a timeline on repayment. Sullivan's legs gave out. He didn't fall gracefully. He just crumpled backward, his knees hitting the cheap carpet with a dull thud. He sat there, his back against the edge of the mattress, staring at the ceiling. We have to give them the binder, he choked out. If they want the ledgers, we give them the ledgers. We can't, I said, crouching down in front of him. If we give them the binder, we are destroying evidence in an active federal investigation. Holt Keating was very clear. That binder is the only thing proving you didn't knowingly orchestrate this fraud. It proves Derek set you up. If you give it to his investors, you are protecting them, and the DOJ will throw you in a federal penitentiary for obstruction. If I don't give it to them, Sullivan said, his eyes welling with tears, they are going to ruin us. It wasn't a hyperbole. It wasn't a dramatic flourish. It was the cold, calculated realization of a man who suddenly understood the exact cost of his blind loyalty. I didn't have a reassuring lie to offer him. I just sat there on the floor next to him, listening to the muffled sound of the highway outside. We take the binder to Holt Keating at noon tomorrow, I said finally. We do exactly what the lawyer says. Until then, nobody leaves this room. I stood up, walked over to the door, and locked the deadbolt. I slid the metal chain into the groove. It felt like a pathetic defense against what was coming, but it was the only thing I could do. I sat down in the scratchy armchair by the window and opened the black binder. I had never cared about finance. I was a history teacher. I cared about the causes of the Peloponnesian War, not corporate tax structures. But I needed to know exactly what my father had signed. I needed to know the names of the people who were coming for us. I flipped past the incorporation certificate. I bypassed the indemnification clauses. I started looking for the original loan origination documents for the commercial credit line. It took me 20 minutes to find it, buried in an appendix section labeled Schedule C, Secured Liabilities. There was a promissory note, $4 million, issued to Callaway Logistics International, secured by the Highland Park estate. I looked at the lender information. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a standard private equity firm. The lender was listed as Kestrel Capital Management, LLC. I pulled out my phone and typed the name into the search bar. The results were completely barren. No website, no LinkedIn profiles, no press releases, just a registered business address in downtown Chicago. A P.O. box. I flipped to the signature page of the loan document. Derek had signed as managing director. Sullivan had signed as vice president. And under the lender authorization, there was a single, illegible scrawl in black ink. Underneath the signature, the printed name of the authorizing agent, Arthur Calloway. I froze. The breath hitched in my throat. I read the name again. Arthur Calloway. My father's name is Sullivan James Calloway. He goes by Sullivan. Adele calls him Arthur sometimes, but Arthur is his middle name. Nobody uses it on legal documents. Except, looking closely at the printed text, it didn't say Sullivan Arthur Calloway. It just said Arthur Calloway. I looked down at the man sitting on the floor leaning against the bed. He had his eyes closed. Dad, I said, my voice barely a whisper. What is Kestrel Capital Management? Sullivan didn't open his eyes. He didn't move. Dad, I repeated, louder this time. Who is Arthur Calloway? Sullivan slowly opened his eyes. He looked at me, and the sheer terror I had seen a moment ago was suddenly gone, replaced by a deep, suffocating shame. My brother, Sullivan said softly. Your uncle Arty. I stared at him. You don't have a brother. I haven't spoken to him in 35 years, Sullivan said, his voice flat and dead. He got involved in some bad things in Chicago back in the 80s. Loan sharking, extortion. Your mother and I cut ties before you were even born to protect the family name. I looked back down at the document. Derek borrowed $4 million from his estranged uncle. Derek didn't know he was estranged, Sullivan said, finally pushing himself up off the floor and sitting on the edge of the mattress. Because Derek went looking for him 5 years ago when his logistics company started hemorrhaging cash. Arty had moved up in the world. He wasn't breaking kneecaps anymore. He was running shadow capital for people who needed their money cleaned. Derek thought he was a genius for tapping into it. You knew about this? I asked, feeling the anger flare hot in my chest. You knew your son was laundering money for a Chicago loan shark run by your brother, and you still let him humiliate me at every family gathering? I didn't know, Sullivan shouted, his face flushing red. I didn't know until a year ago. Derek came to me, panicked. He said Arty was demanding a return on his investment, and Derek didn't have the liquidity. He said Arty threatened him. He begged me for help. So you put the house up as collateral. I put the house up to buy him time, Sullivan admitted, his voice breaking. He promised me he just needed a bridge loan to secure a massive federal contract. He swore he would pay Arty back and release the lien on the house. There was no federal contract, Dad, I said, slamming the binder shut. There was just more debt. Sullivan put his face in his hands. He's my son, Miles. He was terrified. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to tell him no, I said. And you were supposed to tell me the truth when I told you not to wire him that money this morning. I walked over to the window and looked down at the parking lot again. The sun was glaring off the hood of my Civic. The text message from the Chicago number made terrifying sense now. It wasn't some faceless private equity firm. It was Uncle Arty. And he wasn't flying to Dallas tomorrow to talk to lawyers. He was coming to collect his $4 million, and he didn't care if he had to take it from his own brother. Adele walked through the connecting door. She had splashed water on her face, ruining her makeup, but her posture was rigid again. She had rebuilt her armor. Who were you two shouting about? She asked, her eyes darting between me and the binder on the chair. Nobody, Mom, I said. Just go back to your room. I am not a child, Miles. I heard you say Arthur's name. It's nothing, Sullivan said quickly, looking up at her with a pleading expression. Just legal jargon, Adele. She ignored him and walked over to me. She looked down at the binder, then up at my face. Your Uncle Arthur is dead. He died in a car accident before you were born. That's what Sullivan told me. I looked at Sullivan. The layers of lies in this family were so deep, they were structural. He's not dead, Mom, I said, refusing to play along anymore. He's the one who holds the mortgage on your house, and he's coming to Dallas tomorrow to collect. Adele stared at me, then slowly turned her head to look at her husband. The pristine, aggressive armor she had worn for my entire life cracked right down the middle. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just let out a single, shuddering breath and sank onto the edge of the second bed. She sat there for the rest of the evening, staring at the cheap floral pattern on the bedspread, completely silent. Sullivan didn't try to comfort her. He sat in the chair by the window, his face buried in his hands. I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair nearest the door, the black binder resting on my lap, my hand resting flat against its faux leather cover. Every time a car door slammed in the parking lot below, my heart kicked against my ribs. I kept waiting for a knock, for a heavy fist against the veneer wood, but it never came. Just the hum of the mini fridge and the distant rush of I-35. At 10:00 a.m. the next morning, I told them to get up. They moved like ghosts. They didn't shower. They didn't change clothes. Adele picked up her Louis Vuitton bag, its luxury branding looking deeply pathetic against the backdrop of our current reality. We drove to downtown Dallas in silence. Holt Keating's office was on the 22nd floor of a glass and steel high-rise overlooking the arts district. I had expected a lavish, mahogany-lined firm, but Keating's personal office was surprisingly bare. He was a man who didn't need to project wealth because he traded entirely in leverage. He was in his late 50s, with a graying buzz cut and the tired, predatory eyes of a man who spent his life dissecting liars. He didn't offer us coffee. He just pointed to the chairs arranged in front of his desk. The binder, he said, holding out his hand. I handed it to him. He put on a pair of reading glasses, opened to the first page, and started reading. The silence in the room was absolute. For 45 minutes, the only sound was the rustle of heavy paper turning and the occasional scratch of Holt's pen on a legal pad. When he finally reached the end, he closed the binder, took off his glasses, and looked directly at my father. Sullivan, Holt said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. Your oldest son is a sociopath. Sullivan flinched, but he didn't look up from his lap. He built a perfectly insulated legal firewall, and he built it entirely out of you, Holt continued, tapping the cover of the binder. The indemnification clause on the holding company is ironclad. He gave himself all the managing authority and gave you all the liability. Legally speaking, you are the bag holder for a multi-million-dollar international fraud. Can you fix it? Adele whispered, her voice fragile. Can you explain to the judge that he didn't know? Holt looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Ma'am, the federal government doesn't care about his feelings. They care about his signature. The only reason your husband isn't sitting in a holding cell right now is because Derek fled, which establishes a clear consciousness of guilt. But that doesn't absolve Sullivan. What about the text message? I asked, pulling my phone out and sliding it across the desk. The people who hold the mortgage on their house, the Chicago number. Holt picked up the phone. He read the message. He didn't look surprised. He just sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Kestrel Capital Management, Holt muttered. I've dealt with them before. They aren't a bank. They're a laundry machine for organized crime in the Midwest. They use high-interest commercial loans to wash dirty cash into clean real estate. It's my brother, Sullivan croaked. Holt paused, his eyes narrowing. Arthur? Sullivan nodded slowly. Holt actually let out a short, dark laugh. Well, that's a new one. I guess Thanksgiving is off this year. He picked up his desk phone. It changes the mechanics, but not the strategy. What is the strategy? I asked. Total capitulation, Holt said, his tone entirely devoid of warmth. Sullivan is going to walk into the U.S. Attorney's office with me at 2 p.m. today. We are going to hand over this binder. We are going to offer them full, unredacted cooperation regarding Callaway Logistics International, the Cayman Shell accounts, and Kestrel Capital Management. In exchange, I am going to demand a non-prosecution agreement for your father. Sullivan looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. A non-prosecution agreement? I won't go to prison? You won't go to prison, Holt confirmed. But you need to understand exactly what this means, Sullivan. The DOJ will seize the Vanguard Trust. They will seize the Highland Park estate. They will freeze your pensions if they find any commingled funds. You are going to lose everything. The money is gone. The house is gone. You are going to be living on Social Security and whatever clean cash you have in a standard checking account. Adele let out a small, wounded sound, covering her face with her hands. And Arthur? Sullivan asked, his voice trembling. He said he was coming to Dallas today. If I turn this over to the feds, he'll kill me. Holt picked up my phone. He opened the text thread with the Chicago number. His thumbs moved rapidly across the glass screen. Men like your brother don't kill people over frozen assets, Holt said without looking up. They cut their losses and scrub their own ledgers. Violence brings heat, and Kestrel Capital relies on the shadows. He hit send and slid the phone back across the desk to me. I looked at the screen. This is Holt Keating-esque, acting as legal counsel for Sullivan Callaway. The ledgers and incorporation documents for Cly and Kestrel Capital are currently in the custody of the United States Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Texas. Any attempt to collect on the Highland Park collateral will be met with a federal injunction for witness intimidation and racketeering. Do not contact this family again. He won't come to Dallas, Holt said, leaning back in his chair. He's already calling his own lawyers to figure out how to distance himself from Derek's mess. Your brother Arthur is a survivor. He's going to burn Derek's remaining bridges to save himself. But you, Sullivan, you are out of the game entirely. Holt stood up, signaling the end of the discussion. I need an hour to draft the proffer agreement. Go get some lunch. Be back here at 1:30. Don't be late. We rode the elevator down to the lobby in silence. We stepped out onto the glaring white concrete of the Dallas sidewalk. The lunchtime crowd was bustling around us. Men in Italian suits, women with expensive handbags, people who looked exactly like the life my parents used to live. Sullivan and Adele stood near the curb, looking entirely lost. They were in their 70s, and they were starting from zero. I have $3,000 in my checking account, I said, breaking the silence. I'll wire it to whatever clean account Holt sets up for you. It'll be enough to cover a deposit on a small apartment. Sullivan looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin sagging around his jawline. He looked at my worn sneakers, my cheap button-down shirt, my 10-year-old Honda parked at the meter down the block, all the things he had mocked me for, all the evidence of my lack of ambition. Miles, he said, his voice cracking. I don't know how to do this. You'll figure it out, Dad, I said quietly. Adele didn't say anything. She just stared at the reflection of the towering bank buildings and the glass doors of Holt's office building, mourning a kingdom that never really existed. I didn't hug them. I didn't offer a tearful goodbye. The damage between us was too old, too calcified, to be washed away by a single catastrophic weekend. I had done my duty as a son. I had kept them out of federal prison. That was all I owed them. I turned and walked down the street toward my car. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The air conditioning rattled to life, blowing warm air against my face. I pulled my phone out and dialed Fiona. She answered on the first ring. Did you see Keating? Yeah, I said, putting the car in drive and pulling out into the Dallas traffic. He took the binder. They're going to the U.S. Attorney at 2 o'clock to sign a proffer agreement. Fiona exhaled a long breath. Good. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. And to my surprise, I realized it was the absolute truth. I merged onto I-35 South, heading back to Austin, back to my $52,000 a year teaching job, back to my tiny, rented duplex, back to the woman who had looked at the arrogant, untouchable king of our family and dismantled him with 2 sentences. Derek had spent a decade trying to prove he could buy my happiness, trying to show me that money was the only metric of human worth. In the end, he was right about one thing. His money did change my life. The moment he lost it all, I was finally free.